Ethics in a Nutshell: The Philosopher's Approach to Morality in 100 Pages by Dr. Matt Deaton. Published by Notated Press. Print edition copyright 2017. Audiobook copyright 2021. Cover art by Ashley Dawn Addair. Read by the author. Chapter 1. Welcome. Welcome to the Philosopher's Approach to Morality. Studying philosophical ethics can make you a more sophisticated thinker, as well as a more articulate person. It can also make your brain hurt, but usually only temporarily. Whether you're here out of curiosity or for a class, know that doing ethics honestly and with an open mind, aka in good faith, requires courage. Not firefighter courage, but challenges to our views, even self-challenges, can be scary. However, if the thought of developing a richer, more mature understanding of right and wrong is appealing, you've come to the right place. Fans of The Matrix might liken this to Morpheus's red pill warning to Neo. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. I hope any truths you find here are less dramatic than Neo's, but studying ethics definitely takes guts, so buckle up. Nutshell in a Nutshell. This book covers the basics of any good introductory ethics course: what academic philosophy is, why philosophical ethics is compatible with religious moral reasoning, why most ethicists reject the view that morality is a mere matter of personal opinion, the four dominant ethical theories of Kantianism, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and care ethics, the essential role of our moral intuitions, how to construct and evaluate moral arguments, especially moral arguments by analogy, how careful reflection can produce a more coherent set of moral views, and how to develop an all-things-considered view that balances all of the above. The goal isn't to tell you what to think about various moral and political issues, or even to replace whatever method you currently use to decide them. Rather, our modest aim is to introduce these tools with the hope that you'll find some of them worth making your own. I wrote the first version of this book for students in my applied ethics courses at the University of Tennessee, where I had the pleasure of teaching contemporary moral issues, business ethics, bioethics, professional responsibility, and social and political philosophy. I later expanded and revised a similar version to share with the Ethics Bowl community, tweaked that version for my students at the University of Texas at Tyler, revised once again after recording YouTube lectures for each of the chapters, several in my home, one floating down a river, and a handful at landmarks in New York, and made minor improvements in 2021 while recording the audiobook edition. You can access my lecture videos by clicking on the chapter titles in the ebook or by visiting youtube.com/Matt Deaton, PhD, or ethicsinanutshell.org, where you'll also find sample exam and discussion questions, editable syllabi and reading schedules, and an Ask Matt interface. There's even some stuff there in my new book, Abortion Ethics in a Nutshell, a pro-both tour of the moral arguments. However, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we tackle the philosopher's approach to morality, we need a clear idea of exactly what academic philosophy is. What philosophy is and how it's done. Academic philosophy is the reason-based attempt to answer life's big, non-empirical questions, including, did an intelligence create the universe? What does it mean to know something? And how can we be sure we're not trapped in the matrix? Ethics is but one of the four sub-disciplines of philosophy, the other three being logic, the study of the basic rules of reason, progress in which enabled the advent of computer coding; metaphysics, the study of the ultimate nature of the universe, which goes beyond observable, testable science; and epistemology, the study of what constitutes genuine knowledge, which is sometimes oversimplified as justified true belief. The philosopher's subject matter is non-empirical in that it's not directly testable in the physical world, and academic philosophy is the reason-based attempt to answer these sorts of questions because philosophers necessarily employ logic. How? Well, they offer one another arguments, which are collections of claims called premises, intended to support another claim called the conclusion. Now notice how argument and conclusion are used in a special technical sense here, the former not referring to a quarrel between two people, and the latter not referring to the end of a story. An argument can be presented by a single author, and its conclusion can be shared at the beginning rather than the end. Most philosophers' styles are more subtle, but anytime you hear the words therefore or thus, a conclusion is probably nearby. Similarly, the words because and since are premise indicators. For example, here's a deceptively simple ethical argument. Because mammals experience pleasure and pain, their interests therefore deserve consideration. On the surface, we have the observation that animals can experience pleasure and pain, hastily followed by the declaration that their interests deserve consideration. But this is actually a complex argument waiting to be unpacked and examined. It rests on dozens of implicit premises concerning why the ability to experience pleasure and pain, or sentience, is morally significant, why moral significance is tied to an obligation to take mammals' interests seriously, and even what interests, deserves, and other key terms really mean. Part human, part Vulcan. Members of the philosophical community, which you are hereby officially invited to join, construct, share, evaluate, and revise arguments like the example above in a collective effort to make moral progress, similar to how the scientific community uses hypotheses, experiments, observation, and analysis to make scientific progress. Just as a scientist's conclusions are only as good as the accuracy of their instruments, a philosopher's conclusions are only as good as the quality of their arguments. Therefore, conceptual clarity and logical precision are very important. Another similarity between philosophers and scientists is that, like any good scientist, any good philosopher is willing to change his or her mind when given good reason. In both cases, evidence, in the scientist's case, empirical and measurable, in our case, abstract and conceptual, is paramount. Committed first and foremost to the truth, scientists and philosophers are obliged to conclude as the balance of reason suggests, independent of what we might want to believe. Of course, this doesn't mean scientists and philosophers don't possess strongly held views or that we don't prefer to be right. We're only human. It just means that we recognize our fallibility and are therefore happy to adjust our views according to the best arguments, regardless of what we might personally prefer to be true. Good scientists and philosophers are therefore simultaneously smart and humble, which is a stark contrast with the one-sided defend your view to the death approach modeled by politicians, attorneys, and advocates of various causes on television and the web. If a movie character would help, think of Star Trek's Spock. He's serious, logical, and very confident in his reasoning abilities, but at the same time, his devotion to truth requires that Spock remain open to new information and always willing to change his mind. Half human, he's able to draw on his moral intuitions, but half Vulcan, reflection and further analysis sometimes cause him to override his gut reaction. Both emotionally attuned and logically rigorous, Spock is the prototypical ethicist. Plus, he has great hair and a mean nerve pinch. A young Spock actually recites the definition of the philosophical ethical term supererogatory during a flashback of his schooling in the 2009 Star Trek film. Moments later, he pummels bullies for insulting his human mother and eventually exacts revenge on time-traveling Romulans for destroying his home planet. But that's enough Trekkie nerdishness for now. Before we cover some important distinctions between morality, psychology, predictability, and legality, spoiler, just because something's legal does not mean it's moral, and then review the four dominant ethical theories, Kantianism, utilitarianism, care ethics, and virtue ethics, we should first clarify what the term ethics even means, or at least what it means when philosophers use it. Whether this is your first or simply your latest adventure into academic philosophy, I hope you enjoy the journey. Be sure to check out those lecture videos, which are designed to reinforce key concepts we'll cover here in greater depth. And welcome! Kudos for being willing to explore ethics in good faith. That's an increasingly uncommon trait, but one the world desperately needs. And remember that if any of this gives you a headache, hang in there. It'll wear off. Chapter 2, Ethics, Religion, and Public Discourse. The U.S. Senate has an ethics committee. Many companies have official ethics codes, and attorneys are required to take ethics training. But when academic philosophers use the term, they're referring to the reason-guided study of what we morally ought to do. This isn't to say that senators, companies, and lawyers don't use reason. Most certainly do. Or don't make moral decisions. Most certainly try. It just means that what distinguishes the philosopher's approach is that the ultimate grounding for our views is reason itself, not voter preferences, company policy, or legal precedent. Sometimes religious folks are suspicious of this reason-centric approach to morality and worry that thinking through ethical questions from any perspective other than a religious perspective might be disrespectful to their faith. However, many professional philosophers are devoutly religious, and many religious professionals are well-studied in philosophy. Some segregate their religious convictions from their philosophical reasoning, keeping the two mentally separate. They might think, reason leads me to conclude X, but my faith leads me to conclude not X. The big brains argument. How people reconcile conflicts between their non-religious and religious views is, of course, up to them. I personally use philosophy to inform my religious understanding and vice versa. Along with many others, I figure if a creator gave us these big brains, he, she, or it would expect and want us to use them, not only to better understand the natural world for scientific and technological purposes, but the moral world so we can make better decisions. Therefore, it would perhaps be a waste and maybe even a dishonor if we didn't use these big brains to think through tough questions concerning what we morally ought to do. Surely a creator smart and powerful enough to make all this would want us to put these thinkers to good use. You're of course free to use the Philosopher's Toolkit however you see fit. You might simply entertain the approach for the purposes of the class if that's why you're here. The point is that philosophy isn't necessarily hostile to religion. In fact, many believe the two can be quite complementary. Interfaith dialogue and mutual respect. One benefit of being able to think through moral and political issues from a philosophical perspective is that it facilitates conversation with virtually anyone, whereas only being able to reason from a religious perspective limits our appeal to those who happen to share our faith. For example, if in discussing the death penalty, I assert a position that rests on a key quote from the New Testament, my argument may impress Christians, but it isn't likely to convince an agnostic, Jew, Buddhist, Muslim, atheist, Hindu, or any other non-Christian. They may respect the content of the New Testament insofar as they acknowledge that it is important to and carries weight for me, but from their perspective, it would have little authority. Similarly, if someone were to respond to my position, my current position that is, remember, good philosophers are always willing to change their minds, by citing the Quran, their point would have little purchase, for I'm not Muslim. Thankfully, philosophical ethics can facilitate discussion among persons from a variety of backgrounds. This is because it draws on considerations almost everyone recognizes as morally relevant, and the fact that philosophers judge arguments based on their logical force, not their consistency with a particular religious tradition. This ability to transcend comprehensive doctrines is especially useful for those of us living in multicultural societies. It not only enables fruitful discussion, but signals mutual respect. In fact, Christian philosopher Robert Audi argues that thinking through issues from a public perspective, using reasons anyone should be able to appreciate, regardless of their religious commitments or lack thereof, is actually required by the Golden Rule, that doing so is a matter of treating others the way we would like to be treated. To see how, just ask yourself, were I a member of a religious minority, would I want laws governing my behavior based on a religion I don't accept? Would I want my actions coerced and my tax dollars spent according to a faith I don't personally believe? Whether Audi's argument is compelling is for you to decide. Something I love about philosophy is that we're empowered to judge all arguments for ourselves. Of course, we can't simply dismiss an argument before fully understanding it, and we have to fight against our ego's tendency to prefer conclusions that affirm what we want to believe. But so long as we're reasoning in good faith, and so long as we can adequately articulate the reasons behind our views, the conclusions we endorse are up to us. Chapter 3. Why Ethics Isn't Ice Cream. For every person who's adamantly pro-choice, another is adamantly pro-life. Some devote their lives to saving the environment, while others are indifferent. I may feel strongly that eating veal is wrong, but if you feel strongly that it's fine, most assume there's no way to prove which of us is right. Ethical beliefs devolve into lifestyle choices, and people conclude that since 1, there's so much disagreement over moral matters, and since 2, there's no way to conclusively prove who's right, therefore 3. Morality must be a subjective matter of personal taste, similar to which flavor of ice cream is most delicious. Scott's Box of Rocks. However, simply because a question can't be conclusively settled doesn't mean it lacks an objective answer. Take, for example, whether intelligent life exists beyond Earth, something current technology can't conclusively confirm or refute. Those who have studied the issue disagree. Some scientists have concluded that intelligent life does likely exist beyond Earth. Others have concluded it likely does not. Does this mean both camps are simultaneously correct? That there's no real answer? That every view is as good as the next? Of course not. Whether aliens exist depends neither on our ability to know for sure, nor on what we currently happen to believe. Even if there were unanimous scientific consensus, the facts would not change. Aliens don't pop in and out of existence, depending on humans' mind states. And we can judge arguments for and against their existence depending on the plausibility of the premises and the quality of the reasoning. Well, maybe ethics works the same way. It's true that people hold conflicting views on moral matters, and it's true that we can't conclusively prove who's correct. But persistent disagreement doesn't automatically reduce aliens' existence to a matter of personal taste. Therefore, persistent disagreement doesn't automatically reduce moral questions to a matter of personal taste either. I once had a student named Scott explain the idea like this. If a box of rocks may not be opened, its contents may be debatable. Jack may say it contains a live cat. Jill may say it contains a dead cat. But that doesn't mean it contains any kind of cat. It's a box of rocks. If after weighing, shaking, and x-raying the box, you and I agree the evidence supports the conclusion that it contains rocks, Jack and Jill may still insist it contains a cat. But even if we couldn't open the box to prove who's correct, we could compare the reasons supporting our views and use our good sense to decide which made the most sense. Surely it wouldn't be okay to pretend the box contains whatever we want it to contain, or that all views on its contents are equally good. Perhaps we should treat ethics the same way. Just because people disagree over moral matters, this doesn't mean moral questions don't have answers, or that all views are equally good. Evil Johnny. The above is an example of what philosophers sometimes call a negative argument, one that refutes a line of reasoning for a competing conclusion, in this case via counterexamples, rather than providing reasons to accept the conclusion you ultimately aim to support. However, there is one strong, albeit simple, positive argument in favor of the view that morality is an objective subject. It takes the form of a reductio ad absurdum, or reduced to the absurd. And the absurd implication of moral subjectivism is that anything goes. Subjectivism isn't a big deal when we're talking about ice cream. If Johnny sincerely believes skunk oil is the most delicious flavor, that's odd, but who cares? If Johnny loves skunk oil ice cream, we can respect his personal taste from a distance. However, what if Johnny's moral beliefs are just as repugnant? What if he sincerely believes it's morally permissible to torture babies for fun? Johnny doesn't have in mind scenarios where he's forced to torture a baby to prevent terrorists from detonating a nuclear bomb in the middle of New York. No, Johnny believes torturing any baby at any time for any reason is completely morally acceptable, even if one does it just for kicks. Being a moral subjectivist requires giving evil Johnny the thumbs up. Sure, if you're sincere about it, go ahead, torture those babies. Who am I to judge? However, this conflicts with our shared understanding of right and wrong. Maybe some issues are debatable, but if anything is immoral, it's this. And once we admit one exception, the subjectivist view crumbles. If you're not convinced, imagine that Johnny decides to torture you for fun. He kidnaps and straps you to a chair in his basement, tapes your eyelids open, and forces you to watch The Masked Singer. When you scream in agony, Johnny simply laughs and scoots you closer to the screen. I sincerely believe torturing you is extra permissible when you scream. Were you a moral subjectivist, you could plead and protest, but not on ethical grounds. You could beg for mercy. Please play Star Trek The Next Generation or Impractical Jokers, anything but The Masked Singer. But you couldn't argue that Johnny's actions are evil or wrong or immoral. For so long as Johnny believed his actions were morally okay, a moral subjectivist would have to agree. Thus, moral subjectivism is reduced to an unacceptable absurdity. An entire nation of evil Johnnies? We now have some insight into my television habits, plus 2 decent arguments against moral subjectivism. First, the fact that we can't conclusively settle ethical questions doesn't make ethics a matter of personal taste any more than it makes questions concerning the existence of aliens a matter of personal taste. And second, endorsing moral subjectivism would entail the absurd implication that whatever a person happened to believe is ethical would in fact be ethical, repugnant examples of which conflict with our fundamental understanding of right and wrong. At this point, you might wonder if we could instead ground morality in cultural beliefs. This strategy also fails. Even if every last person in Afghanistan believed it was immoral to educate women, that wouldn't make educating women, even women in Afghanistan, immoral. Though biologically different in obvious ways, women and men share a capacity for rational thought as well as an instinctive yearning to learn. Given their relevant similarities, explaining why one should be encouraged to learn, but the other forbidden, might work within certain religious circles, but seems impossible to justify in public terms. If that example isn't convincing, imagine a culture that believed it was okay to enslave people with your shade of skin, or a culture that believed it was okay to exterminate anyone who shared your religion, or anyone who denied their religion, or a culture that imprisoned people for reading this book. Note how these examples are closer to reality than we might want to admit. Now, it could be the case there's something in our nature, implanted by a creator or a result of evolution, that ties morality to our shared perspective as human beings. In a later chapter, we'll consider the important role of our moral intuitions and how seeking coherence among our views and with the views of others is one viable reasoning strategy. All we're saying here is that just because a culture endorses or rejects something doesn't automatically make it so. However, keep in mind that rejecting the idea that ethics is like ice cream does not mean we have all the answers. We don't jump from an overly sheepish, "Who are we to judge, man?" to an arrogant, "I alone possess the irrefutable moral truth." It simply means the answers are out there, somewhere, and that figuring them out will require more than personal reflection or an opinion poll. Chapter 4. 3 Key Distinctions. Sometimes people assume that if an action is legal, it must be moral, and if it's illegal, it must be immoral. Sometimes people assume morality is actually psychology, and that if studies show that most people choose to do X in situation Y, X must be morally permissible. And sometimes people don't immediately appreciate how should and ought are used by ethicists in a prescriptive rather than a predictive sense. These confusions arise in my ethics class every semester, and I'm sure I suffered them myself at one time. So before we dive into the 4 dominant ethical theories, let's take a moment to make 3 key distinctions. Prescriptive versus predictive. When your dentist says brushing your teeth twice a day should prevent cavities, she's making a prediction. Do X and Y should or is likely to follow. However, if she said you should donate your toothbrush to a homeless person, this would be less a prediction of what you're likely to do and more a prediction of what you morally ought to do. Hopefully she'd provide an argument to support such a claim. Even if we have an obligation to provide the less fortunate hygienic tools, gifting new toothbrushes would seem equally effective and much less gross. My point is simply how the word should can be used in both a predictive and a prescriptive way. Ought is similarly bi-definitional. If I say the Vols, the college football team from Knoxville, Tennessee, ought to beat the Gators, the college football team from Gainesville, Florida this season, I'm making a statement about which team I expect to win as a matter of predicting the future, not a statement about how a Vol loss would somehow be immoral, though losses to the Gators often feel immoral to many Vol fans. However, if I said that fans on both sides ought to boycott the Tennessee-Florida game to protest the mounting evidence that football causes serious brain injuries over time, that's a prescriptive statement about doing what's right, not a predictive statement about how the fans are likely to behave. So remember, should and ought can indicate an expected future state or a moral imperative. And since ethics is all about doing what's morally right, philosophers typically use the terms in their prescriptive or evaluative sense. Morality versus psychology. Imagine that a loved one is dying of a rare disease, and the only medicine that can save her is too expensive for you or your family to afford. If you had no other way to acquire it, would it be morally permissible for you to steal the medicine? Before you answer, notice that I didn't ask, if placed in such a situation, whether you would steal the medicine. The question was whether you should steal the medicine. Predicting how you or anyone would likely act is distinct from how you should act if you're to do what's morally right. As ethicists, our job is to figure out what should be done, even if the majority might behave differently. Similarly, because everyone has told a lie and some people have committed murder, doesn't mean lying or murder are morally permissible. Put another way, an is doesn't make an ought. So be sure to separate likelihood or psychological propensity from morality. Though the two may be related, they are not the same. Morality versus legality. A third key distinction is that legal does not necessarily equal moral. As my philosophy of law professor David Rita used to say, good law tracks morality, but doesn't guarantee it. What Dr. Rita meant was that in most cases we desire our laws to be ethically just. But simply because something is legally allowed doesn't mean it's morally permissible, and simply because something is legally forbidden doesn't mean it's immoral. This becomes obvious when we notice how laws differ according to time and location. For example, as of this recording, it is legally permissible to smoke marijuana for recreational purposes in Colorado, but in Vermont, it is not. In contrast, it is currently legally permissible for physicians to facilitate assisted suicides in Vermont, but in Colorado, helping a patient hasten their death would get a doctor arrested. Surely if I were to take off from an airport in Denver, Colorado, and land in Montpelier, Vermont, the moral status of recreational marijuana use and physician-assisted suicide wouldn't magically switch mid-air. Further, consider Oregon, a state in which both physician-assisted suicide and recreational marijuana smoking are legal, and Texas, a state in which both are illegal. Imagine if my plane took off from Denver, refueled in Portland, then traveled to Dallas or Tyler, then to Montpelier and back via some different route. It would certainly make sense to say that physician-assisted suicide and recreational marijuana use became legal and illegal depending on my location, for the legal status of an activity changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But it wouldn't make much sense to say physician-assisted suicide and recreational marijuana use changed from moral to immoral and back again depending on where I happen to be. Note how this relates to the problem of cultural subjectivism from last chapter. Laws are often based on some imperfect approximation of cultural views, which are usually an imperfect aggregation of personal views, which can go in obviously unacceptable directions. We're assuming the people and governments of Colorado, Vermont, Oregon, and Texas have good reason for their differing regulations on recreational marijuana use and physician-assisted suicide. But if I flew to a Taliban-controlled region of Afghanistan, would it suddenly become immoral to educate women? It might become illegal, but surely not immoral. It's of course questionable how well Taliban leaders represent the views of the Afghan people. But the point is simply that cultural views and the laws they support are subject to the same flaws as personal views, and therefore neither personal taste, nor cultural norm, nor legal statute serve as a firm foundation for morality. Yet another problem with conflating legality and morality is that if legality determined morality, legal progress would be difficult, if not impossible. Just like the moral subjectivist being held prisoner in Johnny's basement couldn't protest against having to watch that awful television show on moral grounds, those who would base morality on legality would have to accept what the law currently is with little principled reason to change it. I suppose people could advocate for their self-interests, just like the subjectivist prisoner in Johnny's basement could beg for mercy, but they couldn't say that this or that law should be made more ethically just. Thankfully, most everyone tacitly agrees, and people do advocate to make laws morally better. Which changes constitute genuine improvements is a separate matter. But the point here is simply that morality precedes legality, not the other way around. America's founding fathers realized this, and that's one reason our Constitution includes not only a process whereby laws can be changed, but even a process whereby the Constitution itself can be changed. That's what amendments are. And presumably even the Constitution's amendment procedures could themselves be amended. Therefore, don't look to the law for your morals, not even to the Constitution. Rather than deferring to what currently happens to be legal or illegal, it's our job as ethicists and simply as citizens to figure out what the law should be. That doesn't mean we don't have some moral obligation to obey current law or that law has absolutely no moral standing. Most philosophers would say that a law's moral force increases to the extent that it seems to track objective morality and to the extent that it's the result of a democratic process in a just society. It simply means that we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking legality equals morality. Good law tracks morality, not necessarily the other way around. Chapter 5. The 4 Dominant Ethical Theories. 4 theories dominate contemporary philosophical ethics: Kantianism, consequentialism, of which utilitarianism is the most popular version, virtue ethics, and care ethics. Each is supported by a rich literature filled with intricate nuance. What we'll cover here is only a bird's-eye view of each, with abbreviated versions of each theory's respective supporting argument. Philosophers disagree over which theory enjoys the strongest logical support, but as we'll see, each promotes a basic component of human morality virtually anyone can appreciate and take seriously, regardless of their culture, religion, location, or place in history. Those basic moral components and their associated theories are respect for persons and rational consistency, Kantianism, outcomes, pleasure, and pain, consequentialism or utilitarianism, character, virtue ethics, and relationships, care ethics. Kantianism. He's been dead for 200 years, but philosophers remain in awe of the brilliance of German philosopher Immanuel Kant. With lasting influence in all 4 corners of philosophy, logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics, his impact on ethics is perhaps most profound. Kant argued that what gives persons intrinsic, infinite value is their ability to reason. Our capacity for higher reason facilitates most everything we do, distinguishes us from non-human animals, and gives us the freedom to live lives that are genuinely our own. Like no other earthly creature, human beings can reflect on their personality, character, and lives, decide to change them, form a plan, and take steps to make their vision reality. It's our capacity of reason that enables this unique freedom or autonomy. Further, without reason, we couldn't properly value anything. That is, we couldn't decide which things are more or less important without considering whether, how, and to what extent they align with our goals and commitments. And all of that involves abstract thought, aka reasoning. So since valuing requires reasoning, if we value anything at all, we ought to value reason itself. Kant argued that properly valuing reason entails following 2 rules, which form the heart of Kantian ethics. Those 2 rules are, 1, only do things you could rationally endorse everyone else doing in similar circumstances, and 2, always treat persons with respect and never as mere tools. The first rule, sometimes called the first formulation of the categorical imperative, a fancy term that simply means a rule you should always follow regardless of your immediate aims, precludes lying, stealing, murdering, and the like, for those are actions you couldn't endorse everyone else doing in relatively similar circumstances. This is because if everyone lied, stole, or murdered, we wouldn't gain anything by doing those things ourselves. Imagine a world in which people always lied when it was to their advantage. What would happen? Lots of things, but at root, if people always lied, the social convention of trust, which is based on the expectation that people generally tell the truth, would dissolve. This would mean no one would ever take anyone at their word, and therefore there would be no benefit to lying. If I skipped work to go to a ball game and then tried to convince my boss that I was out sick, she wouldn't believe me if everyone always lied. If I blew my family's grocery money on buying a new Spyderco knife, then tried to convince them I lost the money in a robbery, they wouldn't believe me if everyone always lied. Lying may be personally beneficial when it's rare, but if people did it all the time, lying would be pretty useless. You might ask, what if people only lied under extreme circumstances? Couldn't we universalize lying when, say, there's an axe murderer at the door trying to get in? Actually, no. If everyone always lied when an axe murderer was at their door, well, axe murderers wouldn't believe us when we tried to trick them. Sorry, Mr. Axe Murderer, nobody's home? I know better than that. Burst through door with axe. Kant himself realized as much and maintained that the best an ethical person could do in such a situation would be to lock their door and remain silent. Remember that the question isn't what we'd personally be willing to tolerate or what we'd like to do. It's whether universalizing the action would undermine the advantage we're tempted to seek, such as getting away with skipping work or avoiding a murderer's axe. Theft is similarly non-universalizable. Just imagine a world in which people always stole when it was to their advantage. If the tools I use to accomplish my goals, my laptop, my bicycle, my raft, were constantly being taken, living a productive, meaningful life would be very difficult. I'd spend most of my time securing and reacquiring my stuff, with little time left for riding, family bike rides, or floats down the Hiwassee River. Further, in a world in which everyone always stole, whatever we were able to steal would quickly be stolen, making our original theft quite useless. And apart from being frustrating and pointless, constant widespread theft would make a vibrant economy impossible. For if retailers weren't paid for their inventory and producers weren't paid for their goods, both would quickly go out of business. As we can see, when considering whether an action is consistent with Kantian ethics, the first thing we should do is ask ourselves whether universalizing it would somehow undermine the benefit or advantage we seek. Do this for downloading pirated movies on your own now. What answer did you reach? Why? Kant would say that if you can't endorse everyone else doing something in similar circumstances, it must be somehow irrational and is therefore unethical. However, even if the action you're considering passes this first test, you're not clear just yet. You still need to run it through the second formulation of the categorical imperative, or just that second rule above, and ask whether it shows all involved rational parties adequate respect. Kant's mandate that we show persons adequate respect and never treat them as mere tools is based on his emphasis on our rationality. It's completely fine to abuse a hammer without regard for its welfare, for a hammer can't think, decide, or carry out a life plan. As an inanimate object, a hammer has no interests and is only instrumentally valuable insofar as it can do something for us. The carpenter who swings that hammer, on the other hand, can indeed think, decide, and carry out a life plan. She is a rational, autonomous agent and has many interests with many goals and aspirations. The same is true for you and me. As creatures with complex interests and plans, we desire and expect that others will honor them and not interfere with them without good reason. It is therefore incumbent upon us to treat one another not as simple objects, valuable insofar as we can provide one another some benefit, but as fellow reasoners with intrinsic worth. What exactly this entails has been interpreted differently by different philosophers. Some Kantians argue that treating others with respect mainly entails refraining from doing them harm. However, other Kantians argue that treating persons with respect requires actively helping them when in need and looking out for their best interests. In the business ethics literature, for example, some argue that Kantian respect for persons simply involves being upfront with employees about working conditions and ensuring that they freely agree to their employment contracts. This would mean that if a job involves swimming in a cage with live sharks, an employer would need to ensure applicants and employees were aware of the danger. Others argue that fully respecting employees requires providing a living wage, a safe working environment, and reasonably interesting work, or at least not mind-numbing work. This would mean shark swimmers should not only be informed of the danger, but provided with safety equipment and enough pay to cover basic housing, nutrition, and health care. No one can complain that shark swimmers have a boring job. Which of these interpretations of the second component of Kantian ethics is most convincing, I leave for you to decide. Which seems to best show rational agents adequate respect? Why? Utilitarianism. While Kantianism mandates that we never lie or steal, consequentialism actually requires that we lie and steal when doing so will bring about the best overall future. According to consequentialist ethical theory, a person's actions aren't judged based on whether they show others proper respect or are consistent with a universalizability test, but instead according to the consequences they produce. Utilitarianism, famously popularized by 18th and 19th century English philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, is the most common breed of consequentialism. Utilitarians argue that we have a moral mandate to specifically bring about the consequence of maximized net pleasure, and should choose actions based on their likelihood of producing that aim. This is because pleasure seems to be the only thing valued for its own sake, and there's no reason to think any particular creature's pursuit of it is any more important than the next's. Maximizing net pleasure is therefore a way to treat all creatures with equal respect. Everyone's pleasure and pain count the same in the utilitarian calculus. Let's first consider the utilitarian premise that pleasure is the only thing valued for its own sake. A utilitarian would argue that you no doubt value your toothbrush, but only instrumentally, only because it enables some additional valued result. Namely, your toothbrush keeps your teeth clean and healthy. So it's clean, healthy teeth that you really value, not your toothbrush, right? Actually, a utilitarian would argue that you don't value your teeth for their own sake either. You value them for their ability to help you consume food, or maybe insofar as their cleanliness is integral to your attractiveness, but in any case, not for their own sake. Further, not even food is valuable for its own sake. We value our food for the pleasure its consumption produces and for the nutrition it provides, enabling us to maintain a pleasurable state and otherwise seek out pleasure in ways only healthy people can. So it's the direct experience of pleasure that you value at root, not your food or your ability to chew it or the cleanliness of your teeth, and definitely not your toothbrush. This is true of everything, or so utilitarians argue. Not only our toothbrushes, but our smartphones, our homes, our healthy bodies, even our loved ones are all valued for the pleasure they ultimately facilitate and not for their own sake. Go ahead and run this thought experiment on the things you value. Can you think of something you value for its own sake and not for the pleasure it ultimately brings? Assuming that this line of reasoning works, utilitarians go on to argue that humans are equal in that we all seek to attain pleasure and avoid pain. We may do this in our own way, some by becoming stockbrokers, accountants, and philosophers, others by becoming priests, mothers, and race car drivers. But whatever our path, pleasure is what we're after. Given that we share that basic aim, there's no reason to think that any one person's pursuit of pleasure is more important than the next's. Therefore, the morally right course of action is the one that brings about the most pleasure overall. Utilitarianism can thus be summarized: do whatever will maximize overall net pleasure. It's important to notice that the mandate isn't to maximize your personal pleasure. Utilitarianism isn't an excuse to do whatever's best for you regardless of the impact on others. It isn't selfish egoism. In fact, devout utilitarians will often sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of others when doing so will bring about more pleasure overall. For example, if I'm a utilitarian with a Snickers bar, and sharing it with you will bring about more pleasure overall than eating it myself, I have a moral obligation to do so. I might enjoy 4 units of pleasure if I eat it alone, and only 3 units of pleasure if I share, but if sharing will bring you more than 1 unit of pleasure, that will produce greater than 4 units total, which trumps the 4 units I'd enjoy if I kept it to myself. This example seems pretty easy at first glance, but how can we know for sure that sharing will produce the most net pleasure? After all, maybe the Snickers bar contains rotten peanuts, and instead of just making me sick, sharing it makes you sick too. Now, vomiting side by side, we're both suffering extreme displeasure, whereas had I kept it to myself, only I would be sick. Another problem is that judgments about the pleasure or pain others experience are necessarily uncertain, for we can't get inside anyone else's head and experience the world from their perspective. Based on your expression of satisfaction and moans of chocolate ecstasy, I may think that you enjoy the Snickers bar as much as I do. But maybe 4 units of joy on your scale is only 0.4 units of joy on my scale, in which case maximizing overall pleasure would have required eating it all myself. 4 units for me plus 0 units for you is greater than 3 units for me plus 0.4 units for you. These are serious worries with which utilitarians continue to grapple, but they don't fully undercut the credibility or usefulness of the ethical theory. We naturally make rough utility judgments all the time, and doing so usually works acceptably well. Anytime we're presented with an ethical dilemma, utilitarianism says we should articulate our options, list everyone potentially impacted, consider the likely outcomes of the candidate actions, calculate the net pleasure each is likely to produce, and take whichever path most likely to maximize it. To illustrate, imagine you're walking to freshman English when you pass an apparent stab victim. He's bleeding badly, no one is stopping to help, and you know first aid. You also know your English teacher is giving a quiz at the beginning of next period, and that she does not allow makeups under any circumstances. What should you do? In deciding, first recognize that you have at least two options: go on to class or stop and help, with at least three parties potentially impacted: you, the stab victim, and the stab victim's mother. There are, of course, other options. You could apply a quick tourniquet, dial 911, and run to class. And there are, of course, other parties potentially affected: the stab victim's cousins, the student population, and even the assailant, who will face greater jail time if the victim dies. We're just simplifying the equation to illustrate the method. To further simplify things, we'll quantify each person's pleasure/pain on a 20-point scale, from -10 to +10. Let -10 represent unbearable, excruciating, long-lasting pain. +10 represent wonderful, euphoric, long-lasting pleasure, and 0 represent complete indifference, with everything in between representing some point on that continuum. Option 1. Go to class. If you go on to class, you'll take the quiz, do well if you studied, and avoid bloodying your clothes. So from your perspective, let's say that's +1. For the stab victim, they're going to continue to bleed, risk brain injury and death, and at the very least suffer compounded long-term psychological damage. Not only were they stabbed, but dozens of their peers refused to help them. So from their perspective, given the uncertainty of how bad off they'll be, let's call that a -7. For the stab victim's mother, if you don't stop, she may lose a child, which I'm told is one of the most devastating things that can happen to a parent. And at the very least, she'll be similarly distraught that no one stopped to aid her baby. So let's call that a -7 as well, for a total of -13. Your +1 -7 -7 more. Option 2. Stop and help. If you stop, you'll miss the quiz and ruin your favorite shirt, but the satisfaction you'll gain from saving a life will likely outweigh those comparatively trivial inconveniences. Notice that we're running many calculations for each party: the pain of a missed quiz versus the satisfaction of saving a life. So from your perspective, let's call that a +5. For the stab victim, you'll at the very least partially restore their faith in mankind, prevent lasting damage from extreme blood loss, and might even save their life. However, they still had a really bad day. They still got stabbed, so their overall pleasure can't be too high, which we'll say is -4. Last, the victim's mother will still be upset her baby was stabbed, but she'll be eternally grateful that someone cared enough to save him. So we'll assign that a -4 as well, for a total of -3. Your +5 -4 -4 more. If we visualize this in table form, in the first column we'd have the parties' names, in the second column, go to class, and in the third column, stop and help. The first row would be you, go to class, +1. Stop and help, +5. In the next row, stab victim, go to class, -7. Stop and help, -4. In the next row, victim's mom, go to class, -7. Stop and help, -4. And in the final row, overall net pleasure, go to class, -17. Stop and help, -3. According to our assumptions, which are of course uncertain and rough, it looks like utilitarianism would recommend that you stop and help the stab victim. For doing so would bring about -3 units of net pleasure overall, as opposed to -13 units of net pleasure overall. Ideally, students would leave their shanks at home and no one would get stabbed at all. But if it's happened and these are your options, the utilitarian calculus says the ethical thing to do is stop and help. I hope that's what seemed right according to your common sense moral judgment all along. Just like torturing babies for fun is clearly unethical, a human life clearly carries more moral weight than a quiz grade. However, notice that the math might have come out differently if the person considering stopping wasn't you, but instead an incredibly selfish jerk. If someone cared a great deal about clothes and grades, but very little about human life, that might be enough for the scales to tip in the other direction, and for the utilitarian calculus to recommend they go on to class. However, once we widen the scope of consideration and take into account the impact in terms of multiplied fear and anxiety a murdered peer would have on the student population, it is very unlikely that one person's fixation on GPA and fashion could overcome the negative impact on all others, no matter how big a jerk they happen to be. Last, you may have noticed that the above process would likely prove tedious and impractical. Wait just 1 second, stab victim. Let me break out my calculator and decide whether I should help you. But luckily, there are many rules of thumb that we can follow in a pinch that tend to maximize net pleasure, such as tell the truth, honor others' property, and help those in need when doing so would cause comparatively minor inconvenience. Philosophers have traditionally distinguished between act and rule utilitarianism based on whether one takes the time to run the utilitarian calculus for every decision, act util, or follows those general rules of thumb, such as don't steal, tell the truth, don't unjustifiably kill anyone, that tend to maximize net pleasure when followed generally, rule util. However, even if utilitarianism can be made practical, some have complained that the consequentialist approach to ethics neglects an essential component of being a moral creature, and that essential component concerns the obligations we owe our loved ones, independent of the pleasure or pain prioritizing their interests might bring about. Care ethics. Care ethics was developed as a response to what feminist philosophers considered the cold, calculating, male-stream approach to morality. They argued that our relational ties to family and friends are of obvious moral importance, that it's an irrefutable truth about the human experience that relationships matter. And therefore, any ethical theory that doesn't take relationships very seriously, for example, all the rest, is flawed. Note that its feminist origins doesn't mean care ethics only applies to or is endorsed by women. In fact, as a proud manly man, I can say it is quite consistent with a masculine perspective. After all, protecting and otherwise caring for his family is the quintessential mark of the mature manly man. Caveman grunt. Apart from our relationships just seeming intuitively important, care ethicists argue for the primacy of relational considerations because we're fundamentally interdependent creatures. Though we like to entertain the fantasy that we're independent islands, nobody comes into the world, is successfully reared, or even survives for long without the help and cooperation of lots of other persons. Even hermits, like authors, depend on the good people at Amazon to facilitate sale of their books, as well as delivery persons to deliver them. All of this takes place in an economy involving thousands, all working and living and creating based on knowledge learned from and institutions established by previous generations. And while our ability to live our lives depends largely on the cooperation of strangers, it's our parents, siblings, spouses, close friends, and other loved ones who most directly facilitate our flourishing. They care for us when we're too young, too old, or too sick to care for ourselves, celebrate our victories, console us in our failures, and generally make life worth living. So don't pretend like we're not in this together, care ethicists argue. Acknowledge our shared interdependence, and to the extent that you're emotionally attached and indebted to a particular person, give their interests special priority. We might summarize the requirements of care ethics like this: prioritize the interests of loved ones. To see the clear contrast in this approach with utilitarianism in particular, imagine that aliens have abducted you, your mother, the corporate lawyer, and a cancer researcher. Demented as aliens are, they force you to choose who among you shall live, your mother or the cancer researcher. From the utilitarian perspective, unless your mom does something socially beneficial on the side, you should probably pick her to die and the researcher to live. There's at least a chance the researcher will heal cancer patients and as a result produce pleasure or at least alleviate pain. But your mom, the corporate lawyer, probably maximizes net pain with her evil lawyering trickery. Note that attorneys are the descendants of mercenary reasoners called sophists, who were the ancient enemies of philosophers. So nothing personal against your sweet mom. It's a philosopher thing. If you're a pre-law major, it's not too late. But care ethicists would object that your relationship with your mother should override the potential benefits of saving the researcher instead. Beyond the fact that she brought you into the world, nurtured you, and continues to give you unconditional love, beyond simply owing her for all of this, your bond is granted special moral status for its own sake and should be the determining factor in deciding, despite her poor choice of profession. I'm kidding. Not really. Virtue ethics. So we've talked about only doing stuff we can universalize, treating persons with respect, maximizing net pleasure, and prioritizing the interests of loved ones. It's finally time to discuss a venerated ethical theory that focuses on the root of who we are, our character. We're all familiar with the virtues of honesty, courage, humility, thrift, and the like, as well as the vices of sloth, greed, gluttony, cowardice, and vanity. Virtue ethicists argue that we should do our best to internalize and practice the former and avoid the latter. That ethics is all about developing good character. Why should we care about character? Because doing so will allow us to lead a good life. This is the message ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle conveys to his son Nicomachus in the classic Nicomachean Ethics, transcribed from lectures given in Athens over 2 millennia ago. Cowardly, gluttonous, lazy people are usually dissatisfied with themselves. They're not leading good human lives, not living up to our amazing potential. They know it, everyone else knows it, and their experience as a person is simply less fulfilling than it could be. On the other hand, brave, ambitious people who practice all things in moderation tend to be happier. They lead more satisfying existences, more aligned with what humans are capable of becoming. They push the boundaries of their potential, and as a result, look back on their lives with a smile rather than regret. If you want to live a good life, virtue ethicists say, then you should adhere to the time-tested virtues and avoid the time-tested vices. Do that, or simply ask yourself how a moral exemplar or role model would handle a given situation. For example, many Christian virtue ethicists model their lives after the life of Jesus, and when presented with any dilemma, ask themselves, what would Jesus do? We might summarize the guidance of virtue ethics like this: follow the virtues, avoid the vices, and/or behave as would a moral exemplar. When it's unclear what your exemplar would do, and you're simply attempting to follow the virtues and avoid the vices, knowing which to apply and to what degree is a matter of good judgment. This is also true when virtues apparently recommend conflicting actions. Maybe being brave would require running into a burning building to search for survivors, but maybe being patient would require waiting for the fire department. When pressed to act, what's a thoughtful virtue ethicist to do? These sorts of conflicts have led some to charge that virtue ethics is often imprecise, that it's more about the sort of person we ought to be and less about what we morally ought to do. However, wisdom, considered by Socrates and Plato, who preceded and informed Aristotle, to be the most important virtue, allows a person to recognize the fine line between bravery and recklessness, thrift and miserliness, confidence and arrogance. It helps us discern when to be ambitious and when to be patient. And therefore, the more of this key virtue we gain through study and experience, the easier time we have translating virtuous disposition into virtuous action. Last, some have critiqued that the underlying argument supporting virtue ethics seems selfish. Ethics is about acting virtuously, and acting virtuously is important because it will enable us to live better lives, which will make us happier, more satisfied persons. This justifying argument isn't necessarily bad, but some have complained that its focus on personal benefit is a distinguishing feature of the theory, since the others provide other regarding, or in the case of Kant, reason regarding reasons for their ultimate support. However, our obligation to improve ourselves and lead good lives has also been presented as a civic duty. It was the great-grandfather of Western philosophy, Socrates, who implored his fellow citizens to develop their characters not only for their own good, but for the good of Athenian society. As recounted in Plato's Apology, Socrates argues against the direct pursuit of material possessions in favor of moral goodness, for, quote, "Wealth does not bring goodness, but goodness brings wealth and every other blessing, both to the individual and to the state." End quote. We've now briefly reviewed 4 ethical theories, each presenting a different account of the central requirements of moral behavior. While sometimes all 4 will converge to recommend a similar action, often 2 or more will conflict, one mandating that you save the cancer researcher, another insisting that you save your mother, despite her profession. So you may be wondering which you're supposed to follow. Enter Betsy Postow's All Things Considered approach. Chapter 6, All Things Considered. Though some ethicists are what we might call exclusive Kantians, utilitarians, care ethicists, or virtue ethicists, the majority don't prioritize one theory to the detriment of all others. This is because all four seem to make good points, each expressing some ethical principle already consistent with common sense. Kantianism, we should be rationally consistent and treat persons with respect. Utilitarianism, we should promote good consequences, or, more specifically, maximize net pleasure. Care ethics, the interests of those close to us deserve special priority. Virtue ethics, it's better to have good character than bad. But while it may be clear that all four promote legitimate moral principles, it's often unclear which should guide our action when they conflict. As we saw with the kidnapping aliens example, utilitarianism and care ethics sometimes produce incompatible recommendations. If these demented aliens force me to choose, should I follow utilitarianism and sacrifice my mom, or care ethics and sacrifice the cancer researcher? One solution proposed by 20th century American philosopher Betsy Postell produces what she called an all things considered moral judgment. Postell argued that when presented with a moral dilemma, we should identify which sorts of considerations are in play: respecting persons, promoting good consequences, honoring key relationships, developing good character, or some mix. This tells us which theories are most relevant in a particular case. Maybe the interests of many rational agents are at stake, so Kantianism would have a lot to say, and which are less relevant. Maybe the case deals with strangers only, so care ethics would have little to say. Once we know which ethical theories are most and least relevant, deciding what to do is a matter of weighing and contrasting how powerfully the different theories would recommend different actions. That is, a strong Kantian consideration against an action would override a weak utilitarian consideration for the same action, and vice versa. For example, were I to see one of my students drowning in my neighbor's pond, I would have some obligation to respect my neighbor's property rights and not trespass on her lawn. This is a Kantian consideration that has some force. After all, fidelity to the concept of private property facilitates a functioning economy, which produces goods and services we might otherwise have a tough time obtaining. Therefore, Kant would say, since I can't universalize ignoring property boundaries, I ought not ignore them myself in this case. Kantianism would also place high value on my student's life and might very well allow an exception, but set that aside for now. However, when we consider other morally relevant factors in play, the property claim in this Kantian argument seems comparatively weak. From the utilitarian perspective, I assume drowning is a very unpleasurable experience, not to mention the negative impact my student's death would have on her friends and family. If I trespass on my neighbor's lawn just this one time, her grass won't be damaged too terribly, and I suspect she'll actually thank me for the rescue, for it might prevent a lawsuit as well as a devaluation of her property. Homebuyers hate haunted ponds. Further, though I may not know her very well, I have some relationship with all my students, and so long as saving her wouldn't detract from more pressing obligations to closer loved ones, that's a care ethics reason in favor of rescue. Last, helping under these circumstances seems the sort of thing a compassionate, brave person would do, so virtue ethics would likely endorse rescuing her as well. If nothing else, the virtue of decisiveness would simply encourage me to spring into action as soon as possible. And so we have a relatively weak Kantian prohibition on trespassing juxtaposed against a fairly strong utilitarian argument in favor of rescuing, as well as an additional weak support in favor of rescuing from both care ethics and virtue ethics. We might attempt to quantify the force of these recommendations on a -10 to +10 scale, similar to our utilitarian calculus. -10 would correspond to the strongest possible prohibition, +10 the strongest possible obligation, and 0 would mean that particular theory doesn't seem to apply at all. Our calculations might look like this. Rescue drowning student. Kantianism, weak no, -2. Utilitarianism, strong yes, +7. Care ethics, weak yes, +1. Virtue ethics, weak yes, positive 1. Result, strong yes, positive 7. It looks like we'd have an all things considered obligation to rescue the drowning student of a force of positive 7. Of course, things could get complicated. I live out in the country, and my oldest son recently took up turkey hunting. What if the neighborhood birds have been planning a counterattack, and when they see me running toward the pond, decide to flog and launch droppings on my face? Bombs away! What if when I arrive, I find 2 students drowning, and after fending off the avian assault, only have time and energy to save 1? Or what if I find that instead of a student, the person drowning is a clone of Hitler? These sorts of complex cases can and do happen. Well, coordinated bird attacks are rare, and nobody has to decide whether to save drowning Hitler clones. But morally relevant factors do sometimes pull in opposite directions, and the 4 dominant ethical theories do sometimes recommend conflicting things. However, Postal's approach gives us a way to make decisions that are the best they can be, all things considered. Last, notice that sometimes there's a tension even within ethical theories. For example, adhering to the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative to only do stuff you could universalize would put some emphasis on respecting property rights. But following the second formulation, to always treat persons with respect and never as mere tools, would require considering the value and interests of the drowning student. After all, she possesses the capacity for higher reasoning Kant considers so important. And so while this wouldn't settle the matter alone, the point is simply that for Postal's approach to be effective, we should carefully consider cases from multiple angles, even from multiple angles within a single theory. While the 4 dominant ethical theories and the all things considered approach to resolving conflicts among them can seem abstract and foreign at first, hopefully you can see how they're really just expansions on basic principles and strategies normal people already endorse and practice. Philosophers have done a great job carefully studying, evaluating, clarifying, and in some cases improving common sense morality, of helping us to better understand our moral sense so we can apply it in a more consistent, accurate manner. But the basic elements were there all along to be discovered and polished, not invented from scratch. The final moral reasoning technique we'll explore is likely to seem similarly familiar. My bet is that you make and evaluate moral arguments by analogy all the time, even if you've never called them by that name. Chapter 7, Argument by Analogy. Humans naturally desire consistency in their moral judgments. Treating like cases alike is simply an intuitive requirement of common sense morality. And it's our shared commitment to consistency that allows us to use cases where our judgments are clear to shed light on cases where our judgments are foggy. Below are 2 famous examples, followed by tips on how to analyze this common moral reasoning technique. As you consider Singer and Jarvis Thompson's paired scenarios, ask yourself whether they're relevantly similar or whether key differences break down the suggested connections. Singer's drowning child. Imagine you're walking down the street and see a small child drowning in a shallow pool. What's up with all the drowning people? No one else is around, and if you don't jump in and save them, they'll surely perish. You happen to be wearing a new pair of expensive shoes, and if you jump in, they'll be ruined. However, it seems clear and uncontroversial that the child's life far outweighs the value of your shoes, and so most everyone would agree that the right thing to do is jump in and save them. New shoes be darned. Well, Australian philosopher Peter Singer argues that if you agree that we'd have a moral obligation to save the child in this scenario, you should also agree that we have a moral obligation to donate money to certain charities. Why? Thousands of children die every day from inexpensively treatable diseases such as diarrhea. Therefore, the next time you're in the market for a new pair of shoes, an iPod, an Xbox, or whatever, we should instead donate that money to an organization like Oxfam, who can use it to save the actual life of an actual child. That's an argument by analogy. Singer says that if you agree with this moral assessment over here, a child's life is more important than new shoes when they're drowning in front of you, you should apply similar reasoning and reach a similar conclusion over there. A child's life is more important than new shoes when they're dying of an inexpensively treatable disease thousands of miles away. Never mind that the urgency and vibrancy of a child drowning right in front of you would be more psychologically compelling and harder to ignore than a child dying of diarrhea on the other side of the planet. Remember how psychology doesn't equal morality from Chapter 4? The question is what we morally ought to do, not what we're psychologically apt to do. And given that these two cases seem relevantly similar, we ought to apply similar logic and reach similar conclusions, or so says Singer. If you thought that was an odd argument, imagine that when you awake tomorrow morning, you find yourself surrounded by a group of people in tuxedos and ballroom gowns. Looking to your left, you see that you're connected to one of them lying on a hospital bed via a series of medical tubes, with blood apparently flowing between you. The leader notices that you're waking, stands, and calmly says, "We are the Society for Music Lovers, and the gentleman to your left is a famous violinist, one of the world's greatest violinists, in fact. He has unfortunately been stricken by a harmful kidney disease, and your blood contains a rare protein which he needs constantly circulating through his veins to remain alive. You may find this situation inconvenient, but if you disconnect, he will surely die. Thank you for your cooperation." The question is, were you to awake to find yourself sharing your blood supply with a famous violinist, would you have a moral obligation to remain connected? Doing so would require giving up most sports, and going to school and or work would be tougher, and dating would suddenly become very awkward. But we're talking about the guy's life, so surely it would be unethical to, in effect, kill him just so you can keep up your hobbies and avoid awkwardness, right? On the other hand, all you did was go to bed per usual. It's this Society for Music Lovers who hijacked your body and connected you in this way. Does the fact that the connection was made without your consent mean disconnecting would be less morally problematic? What if they said your connection wouldn't have to last forever, that you only needed to sustain the violinist for, say, 9 months? Would that make a difference? Well, American philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson famously argued that you would have no obligation to remain connected for even 1 month, and that similar reasoning makes it clear that women who become pregnant as the result of rape have no obligation to maintain their pregnancy. Do you see the similarities between the cases? In both, the party providing the life support did not consent to the connecting relationship. In both, some third party brought the two together, the Society for Music Lovers in the first case and a rapist in the second. And in both, the dependent party will die if the relationship is severed. Therefore, if you conclude that you'd have no obligation to remain connected to the violinist, logical consistency demands that you conclude that rape victims have no obligation to maintain a resulting pregnancy. Or so argues Jarvis Thomson. How to analyze arguments by analogy? The best way to analyze an argument by analogy is to look for relevant differences between the cases being compared. For example, with Singer's drowning child/charitable giving argument, while we can know with certainty that the child will live if we jump in the water to save them, when we donate our shoe money to Oxfam, we may wonder how much of it will actually purchase life-saving medicines. As it turns out, Oxfam is an exceptionally effective and efficient charity. But can you think of other dissimilarities between the cases that might weaken the connection and undermine Singer's conclusion? What about Jarvis Thomson's violinist/abortion in cases of rape argument? One dissimilarity is that the famous violinist has presumably already lived a good portion of his life. We might therefore conclude that disconnecting and killing him, or simply allowing him to die if you prefer, wouldn't be quite as tragic as aborting an unborn developing human, or UDH, an intentionally neutral term I use when discussing the ethics of abortion, which has yet to experience the world at all. In other words, maybe we're okay with killing the violinist because he's old, which wouldn't apply to the UDH. Or, arguing in the other direction, the violinist presumably possesses the features of personhood we usually consider morally valuable: consciousness, the ability to feel pleasure and pain, the ability to engage in relationships, higher-order rationality, features that, depending on the stage of pregnancy, may not also be true of the UDH. UDHs are potential persons and later in pregnancy develop some of the features of personhood. But the final feature that distinguishes full persons from all other creatures, our capacity for rational autonomy, actually won't materialize until several years after birth. And so if we think it would be morally permissible to disconnect from the normal adult human violinist, it might be even more permissible to abort a UDH that's the result of rape. Of course, abortion is far too complex an issue to conclude anything definitive here. Just note that when evaluating an argument by analogy, the goal is to look for morally relevant differences. That the Society for Music Lovers hijacked your body while you were sleeping, but most rapes occur while the victim is awake, is a difference, but it doesn't seem to be a morally relevant difference. The morally relevant similarity is that the victim in both cases did not consent to the dependent relationship. Notice how this means that the violinist argument could not be used to justify the permissibility of abortions in cases where the pregnancy is the result of consensual sex. In defense of those sorts of abortions, especially those that are the result of contraceptive failure, Jarvis Thompson offers another creative argument by analogy involving people seeds, which I consider in a YouTube lecture you're invited to watch, as well as in my Abortion Ethics in a Nutshell, a pro-both tour of the moral arguments. So that's how we construct and evaluate arguments by analogy. Arguments by analogy are useful because they can shed light on tricky situations by referencing similar scenarios where we're more confident in our views. And they're powerful because we're implicitly committed to the values of fairness and consistency of treating like cases alike. But what's the basis for all this moral reasoning in the first place? If all we have are abstract theories to reference and similar cases to compare, even if we can neatly reconcile conflicts with Postel's all things considered approach, how do we know we're not working with faulty premises, that we're not organizing an intricate system of baseless assumptions? Though we can't rely on our naked feeling, our moral sense or intuition provides such an input. And in combination with reason, especially when combined with the reason of others, our views can inch closer to objective right and wrong. This approach certainly isn't infallible, but it may be the best humans can do. How does it work? Chapter 8: Intuition, Reflection, and Coherence. As you're finding, philosophers are a cerebral bunch. We're comfortable immersed in complex argumentation, demand precise reasoning, enjoy outlandish thought experiments, and relish complex what-ifs. My fellow Star Trek fans might be inclined to associate philosophers with the highly logical Vulcans, known for their suppressed feelings and cold calculations. But being attuned to our emotional side is actually quite necessary. It's therefore more appropriate to associate ethicists with the half-Vulcan, half-human Spock, which suits me just fine. The value of moral intuition. Most philosophical ethicists agree that when it comes to our baseline, fundamental, no-doubt moral convictions, such as slavery is wrong, killing innocents is wrong, and making people watch The Masked Singer is wrong, we shouldn't allow an elaborate theory to sway our certainty. If an ethical theory tells us slavery is permissible, that's reason to reject or revise the theory, or at least admit its limitations, not reason to endorse slavery. Remember the evil Johnny argument from Chapter 3 for why ethics isn't ice cream? I didn't use a sophisticated explanation to convince you moral subjectivism is fatally flawed. Rather, I exposed how endorsing it prevents us from criticizing baby torturers, and you could intuitively sense the gravity of this weakness. While philosophers are best known for using their minds, we actually need our hearts and minds to work together. We need our moral sentiments to mesh with our moral arguments. Recall how Kantianism, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and care ethics are all tied to some axiom we take for granted as obviously true. Upon reflection, we simply know or can directly see or feel that autonomy/respect, consequences/pleasure/pain, character and relationships are morally relevant concepts. This seems to be ingrained in our experience as persons, regardless of where or when we are, something that we're able to draw upon naturally. That doesn't mean we blindly defer to gut feelings. Rather, our moral intuitions are the primary rockets that launch our ethical theorizing off the ground. Moral reflection and coherence. One goal of philosophical ethics is to develop a rationally consistent set of beliefs supported with strong argumentation. Why? Because that we should treat like cases alike is one of those baseline fundamental principles we can directly sense as true, and because we can't know for sure that our views are coherent until we've subjected them to scrutiny and can rationally defend them to ourselves. At the same time, we want and need our gut-level moral judgments to inform our views. So we test them against similar cases and put them in conversation with candidate ethical principles in an ongoing process of articulation, examination, reevaluation, and revision. We don't use ethical theories to rationalize our prejudices, but rather to improve our broader views. One method for doing this was promoted by 20th century American political philosopher John Rawls, whose work on public reason was the focus of my dissertation, the goal of which is to achieve a state of reflective equilibrium. Maybe a person begins convinced that eating animals, abortion, and promiscuous sex are all three definitely and in all cases morally wrong. Then one day a friend suggests that it's inconsistent to hold those three views simultaneously, that there's some conflict of underlying principles or implications they're not appreciating. Shaken, the person asks themselves, are these views compatible? In deciding, they search for an abstract principle that can organize and make sense of all three judgments. Rawls would advise that they go back and forth between candidate principles and their considered convictions, moral judgments in which they're currently most confident, attempting to achieve some degree of harmony. Ultimately, they should be able to render all of their convictions consistent. But beginning with those that are most interesting or compelling is a smart strategy. Maybe there's a good way to reconcile and logically defend a simultaneous prohibition on eating meat, abortion, and promiscuous sex. Maybe there's not. What do you think? The point is that as a person goes back and forth between their convictions, searching for and testing different guiding principles, they may find that their baseline judgments aren't so certain after all. Maybe after discussion and reflection, they conclude that eating meat or some forms of abortion or promiscuous sex aren't as obviously immoral as they once seemed. Or maybe upon even further reflection, they conclude that all three are even more immoral than they originally thought, as well as consistent with the exact same moral principle. Whatever the case, coherence is a main aim, for anyone who fails to achieve it is subject to criticism on grounds that they're simply being illogical, a grave sin in the eyes of philosophers, scientists, and our friend Spock. Remember, though, that like Spock, we must remain humble. Achieving reflective equilibrium, where our views are consistent with one another, grounded in our moral intuitions and supportable with some rational explanation, doesn't mean they are forever set. Ethicist David DeGrazia articulates this attitude well. Quote, "One must always be open to the possibility that our ethical convictions will require modification in light of further considerations. Thus, while we strive for a state of equilibrium in our total set of ethical convictions, we are never finished with moral inquiry. New problems arise. Fresh information and novel insights make us question old judgments. Moral reasoning is viewed as dynamic and is not expected to produce a final, rationally necessary theory." End quote. You might be reluctant to accept DeGrazia's invitation to remain open to revising your views. If so, that's natural. The philosopher's pursuit of moral truth is an acquired attitude, and changing our minds suggests we were wrong, which most of us don't like doing. But sometimes making yourself vulnerable is the only way to grow. What we stand to lose in comfort and certainty, we stand to gain in wisdom. And if I can admit that I don't have everything figured out, surely you can too. Chapter 9, Conclusion. So that's ethics in a nutshell. Philosophers use our capacity for higher reason to answer moral questions, rather than blindly following their feelings, the crowd, or tradition. They construct arguments, share them with others, and evaluate them together in good faith, meaning honestly, with an open mind, having released their egos from whatever positions they currently happen to hold, in a cooperative pursuit of moral progress. Some ethicists mentally segregate their religious and philosophical moral reasoning, but many find ways for the two to work in a complementary fashion. Ethicists typically use the words ought and should in a prescriptive rather than a predictive way. There's a difference between what people are psychologically prone to do and what they morally ought to do, and philosophers are primarily interested in the latter. And while good law tracks morality, morality and legality are separable, distinct concepts, with the law serving as a shaky foundation for moral judgments. 4 theories dominate contemporary philosophical ethics: Kantianism, utilitarianism, care ethics, and virtue ethics, each of which is grounded in a morally relevant consideration most everyone takes for granted: respect for persons and logical consistency, outcomes and pleasure versus pain, relationships, and character. When it comes to applying those theories and making concrete judgments in real cases, one strategy is to consider what each would have us do separately, and then choose the option that enjoys the most all things considered support. Argument by analogy is a common and powerful moral reasoning technique that resonates with our implicit commitment to treating like cases alike. As we just saw, our intuitions play an important, foundational role in helping us decide which ethical theories and arguments are worthy of endorsement. And the process of contrasting and adjusting our views in the pursuit of reflective equilibrium may be our best method for shedding light on what objective morality is. However, the final step is to seek what Rawls called wide reflective equilibrium, by sharing and building on one another's best insights and arguments in a collaborative effort to improve humanity's moral understanding. As Harvard professor Michael Sandel, whose book Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do I Can't Recommend Highly Enough, says, quote, "Moral reflection is not a solitary pursuit, but a public endeavor. It requires an interlocutor, a friend, a neighbor, a comrade, a fellow citizen. Sometimes the interlocutor can be imagined rather than real, as when we argue with ourselves. But we cannot discover the meaning of justice or the best way to live through introspection alone." End quote. Hopefully that red pill hasn't proven too bitter, and you haven't uncovered anything quite as disturbing as did Neo, who eventually escaped from the Matrix, learned Kung Fu, and fell in love. So there's hope. Whatever the case, be honest in your analyses, humble in your conclusions, and find time to watch a little Star Trek. And remember, humility and courage are both prerequisites for and consequences of developing a more mature understanding of right and wrong. Kudos on beginning that journey. For lecture videos on the chapters, sample essay prompts, exam questions, and more, visit ethicsinanutshell.org. To connect, find me at mattdeaton.com, and if you enjoyed Ethics in a Nutshell, consider telling your friends, but only if doing so makes good all things considered sense. Lecture notes. Whatever the subject, it's a good study habit to articulate key concepts in your own words and organize them in a way that makes the most sense to you. The below outline will get you started, but be sure to create your own custom notes. Highlighting or transposing the way I've explained this stuff won't stick nearly as well as the same ideas conveyed in your unique style. You got this. No sweat. Chapter 1, Introduction. The Philosopher's Basic Building Blocks. Arguments, which are composed of premises intended to logically support conclusions. The Philosopher's Basic Disposition. Devoted to the rational pursuit of truth, but simultaneously humble and willing in principle to alter views when given good reason. Chapter 2, Ethics, Religion, and Public Discourse. Philosophy, the reason-based attempt to answer life's big, non-empirical questions. Philosophical ethics, the reason-based attempt to answer questions about what we morally ought to do. Philosophy and religion. While you can keep them mentally separate, they can also be complementary, and being able to reason from a philosophical perspective can enable interfaith dialogue as well as show respect to your fellow citizens in a multicultural society. Chapter 3. Why Ethics Isn't Ice Cream. The negative argument, aka the smart aliens argument, aka Scott's box of rocks. Just because people disagree over moral issues and there's no conclusive way to prove who's correct, doesn't make ethics a subjective matter of personal taste. Why? Consider how equally intelligent people disagree over whether intelligent life exists beyond Earth, and how we can't conclusively prove who's correct. This doesn't mean aliens' existence is a matter of personal taste. They exist or don't, independent of our beliefs, just like the shape of the Earth is independent of our beliefs. Ethics could work the same way. The positive argument, aka the reductio ad absurdum, aka the evil Johnny argument. Moral subjectivism, or morality as a matter of personal opinion, has repugnant, unacceptable implications, and should therefore be rejected. What sort of repugnant, unacceptable implications? Like having to say that a guy who believes torturing babies for pleasure is morally permissible is correct. Or that a person who kidnaps and tortures you by making you watch The Masked Singer can't be criticized on moral grounds. Chapter 4. 3 key distinctions. Prescriptive versus predictive. When ethicists use the term should or ought, they're usually using them in the morally prescriptive sense, not the predictive sense. Morality versus psychology. Deciding what a person morally ought to do shouldn't be conflated with what a person would be psychologically inclined to do. Morality versus legality. We can't consult the law when answering moral questions, for legal doesn't necessarily equal moral, and illegal doesn't necessarily equal immoral. Why? Consider obviously unethical laws legitimizing the sale of human beings or forbidding women from being educated or voting. Chapter 5. The 4 dominant ethical theories. Kantianism. Only do stuff we could rationally will everyone else do too. Treat persons with respect and never as mere tools. Supporting argument. If we value anything, we should value reason itself, because reason facilitates valuations in the first place. Respecting our fellow persons, who also possess the capacity for higher reason, is a matter of logical consistency, since we're no more special than they are given our roughly equal reasoning abilities. Utilitarianism. Maximize net pleasure. Examine your options, calculate the most likely net pleasure of each, and do whatever will maximize it for all. Consider all impacted, the long-term, and collateral effects. Supporting argument. Pleasure is the only thing intrinsically valuable. All creatures' pleasure and pain pursuits are equally important. Care ethics. Honor obligations arising from relational ties by prioritizing the interests of loved ones. Loved ones matter for their own sake, not because consequences would be bettered or reason appeased. Supporting argument. Humans are fundamentally interdependent creatures. The importance of relational ties is an intuitively undeniable feature of ethical decision-making. Virtue ethics. Practice the acknowledged virtues and avoid the acknowledged vices. Honesty, courage, humility, thrift, temperance versus sloth, greed, gluttony, vanity. Or follow a role model or a moral exemplar. Do what they would do. Supporting argument. Building a virtuous character will likely lead to a fulfilling life. Chapter 6. All things considered. The need for balance. The ethical theories sometimes mandate conflicting actions. We could choose one theory and follow it exclusively, but all 4 are compelling. Postel's solution. Weigh the force of each recommendation within its own theory against the force of the other recommendations within their theories. Go with whichever option enjoys the most overall support. We intuitively make common sense balancing judgments like this already. Postel's all things considered approach simply formalizes our natural practice. Chapter 7. Argument by analogy. Basic structure. When situations are relevantly similar, treat them consistently. Apply reasoning from cases where our judgments are clear to cases where they're less clear. How to analyze? Look for morally relevant differences between the scenarios. If there are none, The reasoning holds. Apply similar moral logic to both. If there are relevant differences, there may be reason to treat them differently. Chapter 8. Intuition, Reflection, and Coherence. The value of our moral intuitions. Our bedrock moral convictions serve as necessary input into the moral reasoning process. Reflection and coherence. Achieving consistency among our views via reflection enables the identification of overarching principles that can be applied to new areas. Chapter 9. Conclusion. Recap of the book, encouragement to reason in good faith with your fellow citizens, and a friendly reminder to watch a little Star Trek. More books by Matt Deaton. Abortion Ethics in a Nutshell, a pro-both tour of the moral arguments. Of all the issues I've had the pleasure to ponder, abortion remains my favorite. Maybe because I enjoy helping people see the humanity in the other side. Maybe because the thought experiments are especially creative. Or maybe because it's where I can do the most to ease political tensions and strengthen civic friendship. Know that the traditional pro-this versus pro-that paradigm is a grossly oversimplified myth, and that abortion is far too complicated for one favored right to override all other concerns. Ready to think through some of the best arguments ethicists have offered? Welcome to the Philosopher's approach to the most divisive issue of our time. Year of the Fighter. Lessons from my midlife crisis adventure. Pushing 40, I'd always wanted to competitively fight, but had never mustered the guts. But when I imagined the regret I'd feel if I never gave it a shot, the shame of my imagined 85-year-old self was enough for me to take the plunge. Just one MMA fight before you turn 40. You got this. What it felt like to step in the ring for the first time, to do it against fighters half my age, and to sometimes win. The joys of punching dudes in the face, hey, ethicists aren't supposed to say that, of being so exhausted and probably concussed that I puked, and what it took to make a lifelong dream reality. Basically, that human autonomy stuff in action. Plus, coaching for tackling your adventures, reflection on how life's brevity gives us all reason to act sooner rather than later, and just a dash of combat arts ethics. The Best Public Speaking Book, 2nd edition. The world needs more ethically minded speakers, so let me show you how to conquer stage fright with the Urban Honey Badger Assertiveness Drill, how to organize your messages so they're easy to remember and deliver, and how to discover and polish your authentic stage self. Don't simply survive as a speaker, decide to dominate. Based on my experience going from terrified rookie to conference presenter, paid keynote speaker, and comedy club host, as well as years coaching students in my oral concentration philosophy classes. The core: know thy material, be thyself, and practice. Ethics Bowl to the rescue! How the anti-debate is saving democracy. From Los Angeles to Long Island, Washington State to Washington, D.C., Texas to Tennessee, ethics bowls are a rising counter to the caustic, childish forces destroying civic discourse. Dubbed the anti-debate by Michigan High School Ethics Bowl organizer Janine DeLay, these transformative events are saving democracy one person at a time. Based on interviews with over 24 coaches, organizers, judges, and participants from as far away as Australia and China, learn why Ethics Bowl deserves its stellar reputation and your support. For more, visit a site I run, ethicsbowl.org. Further reading: Michael Sandel's Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? Including engaging and accessible chapters on ethics, utilitarianism, Kantianism, and political philosophy, libertarianism, liberalism, communitarianism, and covering an impressive range of contemporary moral issues: military service, surrogate mothering, affirmative action, reparations. I've taught ethics using Harvard professor Michael Sandel's Justice for several years and highly recommend it. Accompanying lecture videos from Sandel himself are available at harvardjustice.org, and commentaries on the chapters from yours truly are available at youtube.com/Matt Deaton, PhD. the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy Online. Use the search function at plato.stanford.edu for concise articles on most anything philosophy, including the 4 dominant ethical theories, subjectivism, reflective equilibrium, and much more. Mike Martin's Everyday Morality includes coverage of rights theory, which I don't like, but many smart people do, as well as various contemporary issues and coverage of feminism and multiculturalism. Plus, Professor Mike is an Ethics Bowl fan and volunteer judge, so his book has to be good. Hugh LaFollette's Ethics in Practice, a superb applied ethics anthology featuring a nice balance of articles on issues including euthanasia, treatment of animals, abortion, free speech, the death penalty, guns, wealth, and the environment. This has been Ethics in a Nutshell, The Philosopher's Approach to Morality in 100 Pages, by Dr. Matt Deaton, published by Notaid Press, print edition copyright 2017, audiobook copyright 2021, cover art by Ashley Dawn Addair, read by the author.